Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with Dr. Milt Rosenberg, who died recently at the age of 92. He was a professor at the University of Chicago, but he gained his fame as a radio host for 40 years in Chicago on WGN with a program called Extension 720. It was a nighttime interview program, and since WGN had a strong signal, it ran all over the country, and Milt Rosenberg interviewed all sorts of personalities from all different fields: authors, journalists, politicians, show business performers, people like Margaret Thatcher, George Will, Betty Friedan, Saul Bellow, Bill Murray. Anybody who was in Chicago, you had to come to his studio, which was one of the downsides of being interviewed. He wouldn't do phone interviews. He'd take questions from callers on phone, but he wouldn't do phone interviews. I know that because I was on his show a couple of times, not that I'm in the company of those other people. Here's an example of his show with author James Swenson talking about John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
But the war came to an end, and we know how it worked out. And we focus in now on another crucial chapter, a chapter which transformed the nation's lasting image of Abraham Lincoln, namely his martyr's death. And we zero in not on Lincoln. In fact, we just talked about Lincoln for the full 2 hours with Richard Carwardine, a fine historian, an Englishman, who has done a major new book, Lincoln, A Life of Purpose and Power. We did that about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and that conversation is on our audio archive right now for anyone who wants to hear that 2-hour program. But we zero in instead on an actor, of all things, an actor from a great acting family, the equivalent of the Barrymores of that time.
Yes, John Wilkes Booth, one of the great stars of his age.
Even more so than his brother Edwin?
Well, not in the North. Edwin prospered more in the North. He was a Unionist. He was a pro-Lincoln man. John Wilkes Booth gravitated towards the South. He was raised in Bel Air, Maryland, enjoyed his greatest successes in New Orleans, in Richmond, in other southern cities.
What sort of acting did he do? What kinds of roles did he play?
Mostly Shakespeare. He was known for his great passion, his athleticism, his swordsmanship, his skill with a knife. Some even nicknamed him, with some derision, the gymnastic actor, because he loved to bound from heights on the stage and leap from place to place on the stage.
He did that at Ford's Theater as well, did he not?
Yes, he did. He
broke his leg.
Yes. Well, his leaping ability was a part of his escape plan. He had decided to kill Lincoln that day. He'd been stalking him and thinking about it. He'd given up on his kidnapping plan. In late 1864 and early 65, Booth wanted to turn the course of the war by kidnapping Lincoln in Washington.
What had his career been, apart from his theatrical career, up until that fateful day? He hadn't been in arms, had he?
No.
So you get the idea. Like I say, he did that for 40 years, from 1972 to 2012, when they retired him. When his show was good, it was really interesting, it was really entertaining. To tell you, there were times when he could be a little overly pretentious and a little pompous, but all in all, it was better than about 99% of what you get on radio today. We could use a couple more radio hosts who do his kind of show. Well, to introduce our feature tonight, there's this.
The hyperbole is done. Now we can finally play the game. Look at that. Oh, my goodness. One man. Goodbye. Hello, Haskins. Intercepted by Teague. George Teague to the end zone. Touchdown. We're going to play football. Yippee. Ball's up in the air. Caught. Touchdown. Ball goes into the end zone, and it is incomplete. Hold the phone, everybody. There's a penalty flag thrown, and I think it's against Miami. The royalty of college football is in assembly at the Rose Bowl 2006. He's going for the corner. He got it. Vince Young scores. Texas has defeated Southern California to win the national championship of college football.
Well, to anybody who didn't know, that voice belonged to Keith Jackson, who died recently at the age of 89, one of my favorite sportscasters. And only a couple of weeks ago, we lost Dick Enberg, and I said he was the most versatile of all sportscasters, but if he had competition, it was from Keith Jackson. Keith Jackson broadcast sports with his own style, his southern accent. He was from rural Georgia. In fact, when we talked about Frank Broyles, how he and Keith Jackson actually did some games together, fellow Georgians, and his favorite phrases, the most famous of which was, "Whoa, Nellie." More on that in a little while. He spent most of his most important years broadcasting at ABC, and we have a report from ABC from two young women who probably weren't born by the time Keith Jackson was already a legend.
We do have a passing to report tonight from inside our ABC family. Legendary sportscaster Keith Jackson. Here's ABC's Adrian Bankert on the man that made that famous phrase, "Whoa, Nellie," so famous.
If there was ever a voice that conjures up the majesty of sport's most memorable moments,
Vince Young scored.
it's Keith Jackson's, the thunderous heartbeat behind college football.
College football doesn't exhibit the skills that pro football does, but it's got spirit.
Jackson embodied that spirit in a down-home melodic style with some memorable catchphrases.
Nellie, the last time Brian Creasy ran that car, his dad was chasing him with a stick.
His more than 50-year career in broadcasting spent covering 4 World Series, 10 Olympics.
The spinner has hit the world record into the decathlon sideways.
Most of those years reporting for ABC Sports, starting in 1966. He traveled to 31 countries for the wide world of sports.
It is called the Cinderella story. We've had all the romance. Now let's find out if she can dance.
Awarded numerous honors, his greatest legacy will be for all those college games and for the way he delivered joy to every call. His booming and iconic signature, never to be forgotten.
Well, as she said, his specialty was college football, and he started out in an unlikely place. He was a little young for World War II, but he left Georgia and joined the Marine Corps after World War II, and that allowed him to go to college on the GI Bill, and he attended Washington State. He worked for the college radio station there, and it was obvious that he was a talent. He called Washington State football games in the 50s, and that's where he got his love for the sport, which he ultimately became identified with.
Now the Stanford Indians coming up to the line of scrimmage in what will probably be the last play of the football game. There's the gun. They do not get the play underway. And the crowd of better than 20,000 lets up a whoop, and the dark-shirted Washington State College Cougars have defeated the Stanford Indians by a score of 40-6.
Here's Bob Costas on Keith Jackson as part of a Washington State history.
Hi, Cougar fans. This is Bob Costas. Of all the great names associated with Washington State athletics, the greatest, perhaps, is a guy who didn't make his name on the field, but upstairs in the booth. Keith Jackson is one of the truly great sports broadcasters our industry has ever produced. But he has a further distinction, because only a tiny number of broadcasters can truly be said to be the voice of the sport or the event that they're most associated with. Vin Scully is the voice of baseball. For years and years, Jim McKay was the voice of the Olympics. And the enduring voice of college football in America is Keith Jackson. Whoa, Nellie. Congratulations, Keith.
Keith Jackson did a lot of regional sports in the 60s, but he became a national name in 1970 because he was paired with Howard Cosell and Dandy Don Meredith as the first hosts of Monday Night Football. In fact, he was the first name you heard doing the Murrow commercial of the first game featuring the Jets and the Browns at the old Municipal Stadium in Cleveland. This is when cigarettes could still advertise on television, and this is the first intro to the first Monday Night Football game.
From Municipal Stadium in Cleveland, Ohio, two powers in professional football meet for the first time ever as members of the new American Football Conference of the National Football League. The New York Jets, led by the passing wizardry of Joe Namath, and the Cleveland Browns, led by the power running of Leroy Kelly. This ABC Sports Exclusive is brought to you by Marlboro Filter Cigarettes. Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro Country. By Ford and your Ford dealer, who invite you to come in and test drive the 1971 Fords, the cars with the better ideas. And by Goodyear, the only makers of long-wearing polyglass tires.
He only lasted one season on Monday Night Football, but that was through no fault of his own. Actually, Roone Arledge had wanted Frank Gifford to be one of the initial hosts, but Frank Gifford had a contract with CBS in 1970 and he couldn't get out of it till 1971. So when they got Gifford, Keith Jackson was the odd man out. You can hear some of that in our Frank Gifford podcast. Actually, it was probably the best thing that could have happened to him because then he was able to concentrate on college football. He still did other stuff. In fact, he did some of the broadcasting from the 1972 Olympics in Munich, helping out Jim McKay, our other versatile sportscaster. But Keith Jackson was the man for college football in the 70s, and he coined some of the most famous terms. Among the most well-known terms he coined was calling Michigan Stadium the Big House and calling the Rose Bowl the granddaddy of them all. But there's little question that the most famous term associated with Keith Jackson was, "Whoa, Nellie," and here he talks about how it started.
Oh, Nellie came from my great-grandpa. He was a farmer. He was a whistler with these guys. He was always working and always busy, and but he really didn't whistle. He just kind of one of those, you know. And then he would do something or drop something or whatever, and oftentimes you'd hear him say, "Whoa, Nellie, whoa, Nellie," that kind of stuff. And it's kind of stuck to the little scruffy kid following him around. And there's a lot to the funky thing that I did for some, 64 years. Ted Husey, had made one of the most knowing comments ever, I think, to me, at least stuck to me. He said, "Never be afraid to turn a phrase. And if you make it interesting enough, they may not know what you just said, but they'll look it up."
Fair enough.
And he's right. So I would go around and pluck things off the bush and see if I could find a different way to say some things. And the older I got, the more willing I was to go back into the Southern vernacular because some of it's funny. And it's certainly inoffensive in my view because if you look at the sports announcers that existed in the broadcast industry, particularly after the Second World War, so many of them came from the South. I mean, Lindsey Nelson, Tennessee, Red Barber, and Mel Allen, they've been ongoing for a long time. Mel Allen grew up right down the street from Legion Field in Birmingham. And Al Helfer, he's from down that neck of the woods. So they were all over the country. And all of us trying to find ways, I guess, to say it a little differently to give you some identity. But the one thing you can't ever forget, the playing field is the property of the players and the coaches. It is not to be used by some fat-butted announcer trying to make a name for himself.
That was Keith Jackson. He used to say the college players aren't as skilled as the pros, but college football brings a spirit and something that you just can't get from professional football. Well, Keith Jackson was part of what you couldn't get from professional football, but you could get from college football. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close tonight with Thomas Bopp, who died recently at the age of 68. He was an amateur astronomer, and in 1995, he was out looking at the stars with some friends about 90 miles south of Phoenix, and he became the co-discoverer of the Hale-Bopp comet. Here's a brief CNN Interactive on Thomas Bopp and the Hale-Bopp comet.
July 22nd, 1995. Two strangers 400 miles apart looking through amateur telescopes noticed a fuzzy dot. Alan Hale was at his mountain home in southern New Mexico. Tom Bopp was stargazing with friends in the Arizona desert. Their discovery, made minutes apart, is turning out to be one of the brightest comets to come our way this century, and is not only making friends of perfect strangers, but is linking their names in history. Hale and Bopp traveled the country drumming up interest on the comet show. There are book signings, planetarium shows, and meetings with avid amateur astronomers, where like proud parents they share and compare their pictures of Comet Hale-Bopp. Scientists can't see the core, but estimate Comet Hale-Bopp has a diameter of about 25 miles. If it survives this trip and doesn't melt, it will be back around in about 2,400 years.
So as a final tribute to Thomas Bopp, let's play I Can See for Miles, but not by The Who. Let's do the 1975 cover by the Acid Queen, Tina Turner.